audio. Hello everyone, this is Ernesto with Aftershoot, and in this video we're going to discuss 7 mistakes that most beginner portrait photographers make when they start their career. Let's jump right to it. Okay, so mistake number 1 has to do with camera settings. You see, most people are used to taking photos with their phones and assume that the only thing missing for them to become professional photographers is to buy a professional camera. So they go off and buy a DSLR or a mirrorless camera and immediately start shooting because, after all, photography is just pressing a button, right? Well, not so much. If you're not familiar with the exposure triangle or you don't know what a slow shutter speed might do to your photo, then you're in big trouble. And I've seen this. People get their camera and start moving the dials until the image looks decently exposed on their screens, and then they shoot the photo and notice it looks kind of blurry because the shutter speed was too slow, or sometimes the image looks grainy because the ISO was too high. The first thing you have to do as a beginner portrait photographer, or as a beginner photographer in general, is to learn about the exposure triangle and what each setting is going to do to your photo. So get to it. The second mistake most beginner portrait photographers make is they think too much about the background and not so much about the light. Let's say you go to a park to take someone's portraits and you decide to use a certain lake or bushes as background because the spot looks good to your eye. Generally speaking, that's not a bad idea, but the whole thing changes when the subject stands in front of your background and then the sun hits them in a weird way. Maybe the scene is backlit and the sun is coming directly to your camera and you cannot see the subject very well. Or maybe the sun is to the side and there's a huge shadow that makes your subject's nose look a little too big. These are all things that can happen if you just focus on the background and you don't pay attention to the light around you. Backgrounds are good, they're important, don't get me wrong, but light is always more important. Okay, so the third mistake has to do with lighting too, and it's something I like to call dead eyes. If you're shooting a portrait, again, without considering the light in the scene, you might end up killing your subject. Not literally killing, but something of the sort. You see, when there is no clear light source in the scene, your subject's eyes will not reflect any light. They will look dark, they will look soulless. Without light in their eyes, you will end up with a weird looking, unnatural and disturbing portrait. You have to remember the most important part of a portrait are your subject's eyes. If you shot them with no light, no amount of Photoshop will change their expression. Dead eyes are definitely something to avoid when you're first starting off as a portrait photographer. The fourth mistake has to do with something I used to do a lot. And honestly, I still do it sometimes. Your scene looks good, the light looks good, the background is awesome, the settings are all good, but you see something weird in your subject's shirt or hair or face or background, whatever. You see it, it's there. You can easily just tell them to move it or blow it away, but no, you have a better idea. And in that moment, you say the words you should always avoid saying. That's okay, leave it there, I'll fix it in post. And all of a sudden, you just gave yourself countless hours in front of your computer screen because you thought it was way easier to Photoshop something rather than just to change things while you were still shooting the photo. Do me a favor, work smarter, not harder. Do not leave everything to be fixed in post. Mistake number 5 is again something beginners inherit from their time shooting with phones or simple point-and-shoot cameras. Usually, when people get started, they expect just to click the shutter and wait for the camera to do all the job. The problem is professional cameras have many different focus modes and settings, so if you just shoot and you don't take the time to actually focus your photo, chances are your image will end up out of focus. This also happens with phones, though people sometimes just don't realize it. Whenever you're taking a photo, whatever gear you use, it's always important to take the time to focus your image before you shoot. Sometimes it's done just by half pressing the shutter button, sometimes there's a dedicated focus button for it. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It's always a good idea to take the time to focus the image before you shoot the photo. Trust me, you do not want to end up with a lot of out-of-focus images. If you don't want to end up poor, then mistake number 6 is something you definitely want to avoid. A lot of people think photography is just about owning the right gear. They have this idea that expensive cameras and fancy lenses will somehow make them better photographers and bring them more clients. The reality is, especially when you're starting out, you don't actually need a lot of gear to shoot good photos. It's more about learning to properly expose them and compose your images. Don't get me wrong, gear is important, but only to a certain extent. Buying more stuff is not gonna make you a better photographer. A bad photo can be taken with a cheap camera just as it can be shot with an expensive one. So save that money, put it inside your piggy bank, and save it for your summer vacations. Even though vacations is something photographers don't have. But that's a different subject. And with that being said, mistake number 7 has to do with the way you use the gear you have. In this case, your lens. When people are starting out as portrait photographers, most of the time, they don't know what focal length to use when they shoot in different situations. Say you want a close-up portrait. Well, in that case, assuming you only have one lens, the best thing to do would be to zoom your lens all the way in and compose using that focal length. Something like 70mm will work perfectly for a tight portrait. In cases like this, you want to avoid wider focal lengths because they will tend to distort your subject and give you an unpleasant portrait. Wider focal lengths work perfectly for full body shots when you want to present your subject in a specific environment. A lot of people think zoom lenses should only be zoomed in if you're far from your subject and you need to get closer to get a good photo. But the majority of times, you will choose the focal length before you position yourself to take that photo. So take this into consideration. Anyways, there you go. Those are 7 mistakes most beginner portrait photographers make. So if you're starting out, try to avoid them. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow Aftershoot in all of our social media to be always up to date with the new things we have to offer. See you guys in the next one. Bye.